The arrangement. The rehearsal room of the Moreau Conservatory had never felt smaller. Vivienne pressed her violin against her shoulder, the familiar weight offering little comfort as she stared at the foreclosure notice in her other hand. 3 generations of musical excellence about to be destroyed because her brother Jerome had gambled away everything to people who broke bones for entertainment. The mahogany walls, which had absorbed decades of scales and symphonies, seemed to echo with ghosts of students past. Her grandmother's portrait watched from above the fireplace. Those stern eyes that had once guided Vivienne through her first concert, now witnessing the family's downfall. Miss Moreau, the voice at the doorway made her lower the violin. A man in an expensive suit stood there, looking distinctly out of place among the worn music stands and faded concert posters. Mr. Cross will see you now. Vivienne had heard of Sebastian Cross, of course. Everyone had. The tech mogul who'd built his empire from a single algorithm, who owned half the city's skyline but was never seen at any social events. The man who, according to her brother's terrified confession, held the power to either save or destroy what remained of the Moreau family. The car that waited outside was black and silent, its windows tinted so dark she couldn't see in. The driver said nothing during the 40-minute journey to the cross tower, and Vivienne spent the time memorizing the wood grain of her violin case, the only thing she'd been allowed to bring. Sebastian Cross's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a building that scraped the clouds. When the private elevator opened, Vivienne stepped into a world of glass and steel, where the city sprawled below like a glittering map. Everything was monochrome. Black marble floors, gray walls, white furniture that looked like it had never been touched. He stood with his back to her, silhouetted against floor-to-ceiling windows. Even from behind, he radiated a controlled power that made the air feel thin. When he turned, Vivienne's breath caught. Sebastian Cross was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 32. With hair so dark it seemed to absorb light and eyes the color of winter storms, handsome in a severe way, like a statue carved from marble and shadow. Miss Moreau. His voice was deep, cultured, but completely without warmth. Thank you for coming. Did I have a choice? The words escaped before she could stop them. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or approval. There's always a choice. Your brother made his. Now you're here to deal with the consequences. He gestured to a chair across from a massive desk. Between them, he placed a folder thick with legal documents. The proposition is simple. I need a wife. You need approximately $3 million to save your conservatory and pay off your brother's debts to my associates. Your associates being the criminals he borrowed from? I prefer to think of them as aggressive investors. His smile was sharp as winter frost. But yes, Vivienne's hands clenched in her lap. Why me? Surely a man of your means could find a more willing bride. Willing brides come with expectations. Romance, affection, genuine partnership. He moved to the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. I require none of those things. You're desperate enough to agree to my terms, talented enough to play the part at necessary functions and have no romantic delusions about what this would be. How do you know I have no romantic delusions? He turned back, picking up a tablet from his desk. 26 years old, no significant relationships lasting more than 3 months. Dedicated entirely to your music since age 7. You don't date, Miss Moreau. You practice scales and teach children how to hold a bow correctly. The violation of having her life so thoroughly researched made her skin crawl, but he wasn't wrong. Music had always been her only true love, the conservatory her whole world. The terms, Sebastian continued, returning to business, are these. A 2-year marriage contract. You'll live here, attend required social functions as my wife, and maintain the appearance of a stable marriage. In return, your family's debts disappear, the conservatory remains open, and you receive a generous monthly allowance. And after 2 years? Quiet divorce. You keep the conservatory and a settlement of $5 million. We never have to see each other again. Vivienne looked around the sterile penthouse, imagining 2 years in this beautiful prison. But then she thought of her students, of little Amelia who'd just started learning vibrato, of the scholarship kids who had nowhere else to learn music. When? She asked quietly. Saturday. City Hall. 2 witnesses, no guests, no fuss. He pulled out another document. Sign here, and your brother's debts are cleared tonight. Her hand shook as she took the pen. The signature looked like someone else's name. Breaking barriers. The first month in Sebastian's penthouse passed like a strange dream. Vivienne developed routines to fill the emptiness. Morning coffee on the balcony watching the city wake up. Afternoon practice sessions in the music room she discovered behind what looked like a wall panel. Evening meals alone while Sebastian worked in his office until midnight or later. The music room had been the only surprise in the sterile penthouse. Hidden behind a seamless door, it contained a Steinway grand piano that hadn't been played in years, based on the dust. Sheet music was scattered across the bench, abandoned mid-phrase as if someone had simply stopped playing one day and never returned. Vivienne had claimed the room as her sanctuary, bringing her violin there every afternoon. The acoustics were perfect, designed by someone who understood how sound should move through space. Sometimes when she played, she could swear she heard footsteps pause outside the door, but Sebastian never entered. Their interactions remained minimal and professional. He left before she woke most mornings, though fresh coffee always waited in the kitchen, made exactly how she liked it. They occasionally shared dinner when his work demanded he eat, but conversation never went beyond polite inquiries about her day or discussions of upcoming social obligations. It was during the 5th week that everything began to shift. Vivienne woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of something breaking. She found Sebastian in his office, a crystal tumbler in pieces on the floor, his phone clenched in his hand. His usually perfect composure had cracked, revealing something raw underneath. "Sebastian?" She stayed in the doorway, uncertain. He looked up and for a moment forgot to hide behind his cold mask. Pain flickered across his features before he reassembled his defenses. "Go back to bed, Vivienne." Instead, she walked to the kitchen and made tea. Chamomile with honey, the same thing her grandmother used to make when the world felt too heavy. She brought 2 cups to his office and set one on his desk, then sat in the chair across from him without asking permission. "You don't have to tell me," she said softly, "but you don't have to be alone either." They sat in silence for 20 minutes before he spoke. "Today would have been Emma's 30th birthday." "Emma?" "My sister." The words seemed to cost him. "She disappeared 7 years ago. Left a note saying she couldn't live in our father's shadow anymore. Couldn't be another cross-dynasty puppet. I haven't heard from her since." Vivienne thought of her own brother, frustrating and reckless as he was, and couldn't imagine losing him entirely. "Is that why your father insisted on the marriage clause in your inheritance?" Sebastian's laugh was bitter. "Partially. He thinks a wife will make me more stable, less likely to abandon the empire he built. What he doesn't understand is that Emma left because we were never allowed to be human. We were investments trained from birth to multiply his wealth and power. Yet you're following his rules. The marriage contract. The company employs 30,000 people. If I don't meet his terms, he'll dissolve everything. Sell it for parts. All those jobs gone." He finally looked at her directly. "I'm trapped between being the man he wants me to be and protecting the people who depend on me." Vivienne stood and moved to the window, looking out at the city lights. "When I was 15, I had the chance to join the Vienna Philharmonic's youth program. It would have meant leaving the conservatory, leaving my family. My grandmother was sick, my brother was still in school. I stayed. Do you regret it? Every day? And never." She turned back to him. "That's what love does, isn't it? Makes us choose chains we'd never accept for ourselves alone." Something shifted in his expression. A recognition, perhaps. "Is that what this is for you, chains?" "Gilded ones," she admitted. "But yes." He stood abruptly, moving past her to the window. For a long moment, they stood side by side looking out at the sleeping city. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, he said, "Play for me sometime. In the music room. I'd like to hear you play." The next evening, Vivienne was practicing a particularly difficult passage from Tchaikovsky when she sensed him in the doorway. She didn't stop playing and he didn't enter, but she could feel him listening. When she finished, he was gone, but a cup of tea waited on the small table by the door, still warm. It became their routine. She would play. He would listen from the doorway, never entering but always present. Sometimes she chose pieces that felt like conversations, questioning passages from Brahms, stormy movements from Vivaldi, gentle nocturnes from Chopin that seemed to speak the words neither of them could say. The truth unveiled. The charity gala arrived 2 months into their arrangement. Vivienne wore a midnight blue gown Sebastian had selected, and when she emerged from her room, She caught something unguarded in his expression before his usual mask slipped back into place. "You look appropriate," he said, but his voice carried an undertone that made the clinical word feel like poetry. The gala was held at the Cross Foundation's headquarters, a gleaming monument to wealth and power. Sebastian's father, Richard Cross, commanded the room like a general surveying his territory. When he looked at Vivian, his smile was cold calculation. "So this is the woman who finally caught my son," Richard said, his tone suggesting he knew exactly what kind of arrangement this was. "A musician. How bohemian." "Vivian is a graduate of Juilliard," Sebastian interjected, his hand finding the small of her back. "She speaks 4 languages and has performed at Carnegie Hall. Hardly bohemian." It was the first time he'd defended her, and the warmth of his hand through the silk of her dress made her pulse quicken. Richard's eyes narrowed, noting his son's protective gesture. "How wonderful," Richard said flatly. "I'm sure she'll be a proper addition to the family. Once she learns our ways, of course." The condescension in his tone made Vivian's spine straighten. "I find that the best families are those that evolve, Mr. Cross. Tradition without growth is just stagnation dressed in expensive clothes." Richard's face darkened. But before he could respond, Sebastian guided her away. "That was dangerous," he murmured in her ear. "That was necessary," she replied. Later, as they danced, a required performance for the attendees, Sebastian held her closer than propriety demanded. "No one's ever stood up to him like that. Not since Emma." "Maybe that's been the problem," Vivian said. "Everyone's so afraid of him. They forget he's just a man with too much money and too little heart." Sebastian's hand tightened on her waist.
"You don't know what he's capable of." "I know what you're capable of," she countered.
"And it's so much more than being his echo." They stopped dancing, standing still in the middle of the floor while other couples swirled around them. Sebastian's storm-gray eyes searched hers, and for a moment the careful distance between them collapsed. "Vivian," he started, but his phone buzzed urgently. The moment shattered. The call was brief, but Sebastian's face went white. "We need to leave, now." Revelations and choices back at the penthouse, Sebastian paced his office while Vivian waited. Finally, he spoke. "That was about Emma. She's been found. She's been in Seattle, working at a homeless shelter under a different name. She's been there for 7 years, helping people our father would step over in the street." "That's wonderful, isn't it? She's alive, she's safe." "She's also been investigating our father. She has evidence of things that could destroy him. Money laundering, bribery, worse. She's planning to go public next week." Vivian absorbed this. "And you're worried about the company?" "I'm worried about her. My father doesn't handle threats well. If he knows she's planning this..." Sebastian trailed off, his meaning clear. "Then we stop him first," Vivian said simply. Sebastian looked at her sharply. "We? Did you think I'd sit by while your sister risks everything to do the right thing? I may have married you for money, Sebastian, but I'm not without conscience. This isn't your fight, isn't it?" Vivian stood, moving toward him. "I've lived here for 2 months. I've watched you work yourself to exhaustion trying to be a good man in a bad man's empire. I've seen you listen to my music from the doorway, too afraid to step inside. I've felt you watching me when you think I won't notice. Like you're starving for something you won't let yourself have. Vivian, I know this was supposed to be business," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "But somewhere between that first cup of tea and tonight, when you defended me to your father, it became something else. At least for me." Sebastian stood frozen, his usual control crumbling. "You don't understand. I don't know how to be what you're asking me to be. I've spent so long building walls." "Then stop," Vivian interrupted. "Stop building walls and start building bridges. Your sister is trying to tear down your father's empire of fear. Help her. Choose to be the man you are when you think no one's watching. The one who makes perfect coffee and listens to violin concertos and protects people even when it costs him." The next morning, Emma Cross arrived at the penthouse. She looked like Sebastian. The same dark hair, the same storm-gray eyes, but where his were guarded, hers blazed with purpose. The siblings' reunion was awkward, 7 years of silence standing between them. But when Emma saw Vivian, she smiled. "You must be the wife father arranged," Emma said. "I'm the wife Sebastian chose," Vivian corrected. "Whatever the circumstances." Emma studied her for a long moment, then turned to her brother. "She's not what I expected." She rarely is, Sebastian said softly, his eyes on Vivienne. They spent the day planning. Emma had documents, recordings, evidence that painted Richard Cross as a man who'd built his empire on the suffering of others. Sebastian had inside access to financial records that would corroborate everything. Together they could bring him down, but it would mean destroying everything Sebastian had worked to protect. The employees, Sebastian kept saying. 30,000 people depend on Cross Industries. They depend on the company, not on Father, Emma argued. The board will appoint new leadership. The company will survive. It might even thrive without his poison. That evening, as Vivienne played in the music room, Sebastian finally entered. He sat beside her on the piano bench, their shoulders touching. If we do this, he said quietly, everything changes. The arrangement, the contract, none of it will matter anymore. My father will destroy the marriage clause in retaliation. You could leave. Take your conservatory and go. Vivienne set down her violin and turned to face him. Is that what you want? For me to go? I want, he started, then stopped. I want so many things I don't know how to ask for. Then let me ask instead, Vivienne said. She took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. Sebastian Cross, would you like to actually marry me? Not for contracts or inheritance or appearances, but because somewhere in these 2 months, despite every logical reason not to, we've started to fall in love. His answer was to kiss her. Not the brief, obligatory kiss from their wedding, but something deep and desperate and full of 2 months of unspoken longing. The new beginning, the scandal, broke on a Tuesday. Every major news outlet carried the story of Richard Cross's fall from grace. Emma had orchestrated the reveal perfectly, ensuring the evidence reached journalists, law enforcement, and regulatory bodies simultaneously. By Wednesday, Richard was under federal investigation. By Thursday, he'd fled the country. Sebastian stood in what had been his father's office, now his, looking out at the city. The board had unanimously appointed him as CEO, desperate for stable leadership during the crisis. Stock prices had plummeted, then surprisingly recovered as investors realized the company might actually run better without Richard's corruption. You did the right thing, Vivienne said from the doorway. Did I? 30,000 people are terrified for their jobs. 30,000 people are about to discover what it's like to work for someone with integrity. She moved to stand beside him. Emma told me about your plans. The employee profit sharing, the ethical restructuring, the foundation for arts education. That last one was your idea, he reminded her, pulling her against his side. Our idea, she corrected. Partners, remember? 3 weeks after Richard's flight, they held another ceremony. This time the penthouse was full of warmth. Emma had helped Vivienne redecorate, adding color and life to the sterile spaces. The conservatory students played music. Sebastian's employees mingled with Vivienne's musicians, and Jerome, finally free from his debts and attending Gamblers Anonymous, served as Sebastian's best man. I have a confession, Sebastian said during their first dance. I heard you play that first day before you even moved in. I was inspecting the penthouse and heard violin music from the street. I looked down and saw you teaching a child on the conservatory steps, showing her how to hold the bow. That's when I knew the arrangement would work. Because I was desperate. Because you were kind. Even facing loss, you were patient with that child, gentle. I thought maybe someone like that could teach me to be human again. And have I? Sebastian spun her, then pulled her back. You've taught me that being human isn't about being perfect. It's about being present, being vulnerable, being willing to change. 6 months later, the conservatory had expanded into the building next door, funded by the Cross Foundation's New Arts Initiative. Vivienne split her time between teaching, performing, and working with Sebastian to reshape Cross Industries into something that created, rather than consumed. Emma returned from Seattle to run the Foundation's homeless initiatives, bringing with her a doctor named James, whom she'd fallen in love with during her years away. The penthouse, once cold and empty, became the gathering place for family dinners, impromptu concerts, and late-night planning sessions for their various charitable ventures. On their first real anniversary, counting from that night of tea and truth rather than the contracted ceremony, Sebastian gave Vivienne a gift. It was the sheet music from the hidden room, but now complete. He'd hired a composer to finish the pieces his mother had started before her death. The compositions she'd abandoned when Richard had told her music was a waste of a Cross's time. She would have loved you, Sebastian said, as Vivian's sight read through the beautiful, complex melodies. She always said the right person would bring music back to this family. That night, as they lay together in what was now truly their home, Vivian traced patterns on Sebastian's chest. Do you ever think about how different this all could have been? If Jerome hadn't gambled, if your father hadn't demanded marriage. Every day, Sebastian admitted. And every day I'm grateful for the chain of disasters that brought you here. Is that terrible? No, Vivian said, thinking of her grandmother's portrait now hanging in the penthouse library, of the conservatory thriving, of the students whose lives were changed by the foundation. Sometimes the worst circumstances create the best possibilities. A forced marriage that became a choice, Sebastian mused. The best choice, Vivian corrected, and kissed him to prove it. Outside their windows, the city sparkled with its million lights, each one a life, a story, a possibility. Inside, two people who'd begun as strangers bound by necessity had built something neither contract nor circumstance could have predicted. A love that was chosen, fought for and renewed every day. The music room was no longer hidden. Its door stood open, filling the penthouse with melody, and sometimes late at night Sebastian would play the piano, while Vivian accompanied on violin, their harmonies intertwining like their lives, unexpected, imperfect, and absolutely beautiful.